What happens when a power-hungry HOA president underestimates a rancher protecting his family's 150-year legacy? One bullet away from disaster, everything changes in an instant. Before we begin, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this. My heart stops when Karen pulls the gun from her purse, pointing it directly at my chest. For a horrifying moment, I'm just a rancher staring down the barrel of a weapon, my hands shaking as I grip my phone. "This ranch will never belong to you," she says with chilling confidence. "One way or another, your family's legacy ends today." She laughs and mocks me. But something changes inside me. My grip steadies. My breathing slows. "You're standing on Thompson land, Karen. We've held it through world wars and depressions. You think you're the first bully we've faced?" Truth is, while she was sending harassment letters and manipulating local officials, I was quietly working on something that would change everything between us. Something she never saw coming because she was too busy underestimating the simple rancher she thought I was. Have you ever been in a situation where someone completely misjudged who they were dealing with? Drop a comment below with your story. Some people only learn the hard way that appearances can be deceiving. And Karen's expensive education is just beginning. 8 months ago, I never would have imagined myself in a standoff with a power-hungry HOA president brandishing a firearm on my own property. Back then, I was just trying to figure out how to keep my family's legacy alive. My name is Mason Thompson, and until recently, I was a software engineer working remotely for a tech company in Austin. That changed when my parents died in a car accident, leaving me Sweetwater Ranch, 150 acres of Texas land that had been in my family for a century and a half. I packed up my apartment, said goodbye to city life, and moved back to the place where I grew up, determined to honor my parents by keeping the ranch running. The problem was, I knew more about coding than cattle. Thankfully, I had help. Jake Wilson, our 65-year-old ranch manager, had worked for my family for over 40 years and knew every inch of Sweetwater. He treated me like the son he never had, especially after my parents passed. "This land has Thompson blood mixed in with the soil," he told me my first day back. "Your ancestors built something that lasted, and now it's your turn to carry it forward." My neighbor Rachel Henderson was another blessing. A 42-year-old, 42-year-old widow with 2 kids, she ran the adjacent property and knew more about modern ranching than anyone in the county. She started dropping by with casseroles and ranching advice, both equally valuable to a bachelor who could barely boil water and had no idea how to maintain the irrigation systems. Life was starting to find a rhythm when I first met Karen Wilkins. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was fixing fence posts with Jake when a shiny black SUV pulled up our driveway, kicking up dust that seemed to offend its very existence. Out stepped a woman in her early 50s, wearing beige slacks and a pink blouse that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her blonde hair was cut in that specific, "I demand to speak to the manager" style, and the giant sunglasses she wore couldn't hide the look of disdain as she surveyed our property. "Are you the owner?" she asked, not bothering with a greeting. When I confirmed, she introduced herself as Karen Wilkins, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I had heard about Oak Ridge, a luxury development that had sprung up about half a mile from the edge of my property in the last decade. "We've received numerous complaints about the odors coming from your operation," she said, waving a manicured hand toward my livestock pens. "It's affecting our residents' quality of life, and we need you to address it immediately." I tried explaining that ranches tend to have animals, and animals tend to have smells, and that my family had been here long before their manicured lawns and community pool. I also pointed out that my property wasn't part of their HOA, so their regulations didn't apply to me. Karen's face tightened like she'd tasted something sour. "Mr. Thompson, we have ways of dealing with uncooperative neighbors. I strongly suggest you find a solution." As she turned to leave, she paused. "And you might want to cut your grass. It's an eyesore visible from the Oak Ridge entrance." After she left, Jake chuckled. The Wilkins woman again? Her husband James is that developer who's been buying up all the land around here. They've been trying to get your parents to sell for years. A week later, I found an official-looking envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a letter from the Oak Ridge Estates HOA citing violations for excessive grass height, unapproved structures, apparently referring to our historic barn, and unauthorized commercial activity, along with the demand for $5,000 in fines. I nearly choked on my coffee. The letter also hinted that continued non-compliance would result in escalating enforcement actions. I called my college buddy Sam Martinez, who had become a real estate attorney, and sent him photos of the letter. His response came quickly. "They have no jurisdiction over your property, Mason. This is harassment, plain and simple. But be careful. Karen's husband, James Wilkins, has deep pockets and connections with local officials. This isn't their first rodeo." Sam suggested I do some research into any development plans in the area. That night, I dug through county records online and found something disturbing. James Wilkins Development Company had filed permits for a project called Oak Ridge Grand, a luxury resort and residential complex. The proposed development wrapped around my property on 3 sides. They weren't just targeting me because of some smell. They wanted my land, and they were trying to bully me into selling cheap. The realization made my blood boil. This wasn't just about an entitled woman with too much power. This was a calculated attack on my family's legacy. I decided then that I wouldn't just defend my land. I would stand my ground against whatever they threw at me. Little did I know how ugly things would get, or that in 8 months I'd be holding the deed to Karen Wilkins' own house. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The real battle was just beginning. And before it was over, I'd learn exactly what people are capable of when money, power, and land are at stake. The harassment started small, but escalated quickly. Every day brought a new letter from the HOA, each with more ridiculous violations than the last. One cited the non-regulation color of my barn, the same red barn that had stood on the property since the 1930s. Another complained about my roosters crowing too early and disturbing the peace. I started keeping a file of every communication on Sam's advice. "Document everything," he said. "If this goes to court, you'll need proof of their pattern of behavior." But letters were just the beginning. I began noticing unfamiliar vehicles parked along my fence line, taking photos of my property. When I approached them, they claimed to be from county compliance, but sped off before I could verify their credentials. One morning, I discovered someone had left my cattle gate open overnight, letting a dozen head wander onto the county road. Thankfully, Rachel spotted them on her way to drop her kids at school and helped me round them up before any accidents occurred. "This wasn't an accident," she told me as we herded the last steer back through the gate. "Someone's trying to cause problems for you." Rachel's expression grew serious. "They did the same thing to me 3 years ago after Stephen died. Karen kept sending me notices about violations, saying my property was lowering their home values. I couldn't fight them. Not as a newly widowed mom with 2 young kids and a mortgage. I sold them 10 acres of my north pasture just to get them off my back." Her admission surprised me. Rachel had always seemed so strong and self-sufficient. "You should know what you're up against, Mason. Karen is just the public face. Her husband James is the real power. He's been systematically buying up all the land around Oak Ridge for his new development. Your ranch is the biggest obstacle in their way." That evening, I received a call from Sam with more concerning news. He discovered that Mayor Robert Davis had recently approved a public right-of-way through part of my property without notifying me. The proposed access road would cut right through my best pasture and effectively divide my ranch in half. "This is textbook, Mason," Sam explained. "They're trying to devalue your property before making an offer. Once that road goes in, your ranch operations become much harder to maintain and your land value drops. Then they swoop in with a lowball offer that seems like your only way out." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. How can the mayor approve something like that without my knowledge? Don't I have property rights? Sam sighed. You do, but Mayor Davis and James Wilkins play golf together every Sunday. The approval was buried in a routine infrastructure vote at the last city council meeting. We can contest it, but it'll take time and money. As I hung up, my phone immediately rang again. An unknown number. When I answered, a gruff voice said, "You should take the hint and sell the ranch while you still can. Things can get dangerous for stubborn people." The line went dead before I could respond. I stood there, phone in hand, shock giving way to anger. They were escalating from harassment to threats. I immediately called the county sheriff's office to report the call, but without caller ID information, there wasn't much they could do. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the old farmhouse, every distant sound had me reaching for the baseball bat I'd placed beside my bed. This wasn't just about land anymore. It felt personal and potentially dangerous. The next morning, I made a decision. Instead of just playing defense, it was time to go public. The monthly city council meeting was scheduled for the following evening, and citizens were allowed 3 minutes each during the public comment period. I spent the day preparing my statement, gathering documentation of the harassment, and making copies of the development plans I'd found. Rachel offered to come for moral support, and Jake insisted on attending too, saying, "Those city folks need to see that you've got people behind you." When we arrived at City Hall, I was surprised to see the parking lot nearly full. Usually these meetings drew only a handful of concerned citizens, but tonight every seat in the chamber was occupied. Karen and James Wilkins sat in the front row, along with several people wearing Oak Ridge Estates polo shirts. Mayor Davis looked uncomfortable when he spotted me walking in with my small group. During the standard business portion of the meeting, I noticed how many agenda items seemed to benefit Wilkins' development group. Easements granted, zoning changes approved, tax incentives offered. It was clear that James had significant influence over local governance. When the public comment period finally began, I walked to the podium, hands shaking slightly as I placed my notes before me. I introduced myself and explained that I was the current owner of Sweetwater Ranch, a property that had been in my family for 7 generations. I described the harassment from the HOA, the threats, and the questionable approval of a right-of-way through my land. This appears to be a coordinated effort to force me to sell my family's historic property below market value. I stated, "I've brought copies of the harassment, documentation, and would like to request a formal investigation into potential ethics violations regarding the approval of developments that directly benefit certain council members' associates." Mayor Davis's face flushed red, and he began to interrupt, claiming my time was up despite the clock showing I had 30 seconds remaining. Before he could cut my microphone, a man's voice boomed from the back of the room. "Let him finish, Bob. Or have you forgotten that this is still a public meeting?" Heads turned to see my Uncle Frank, a retired Army colonel I hadn't seen in years, standing at the back in his full Veterans Organization regalia. Frank had grown up on Sweetwater before joining the military, and he commanded respect in the community. With a reluctant nod from the mayor, I finished my statement, officially submitting my documents to the city clerk. After the meeting, a petite woman approached me, introducing herself as Councilwoman Lisa Chen. "That was brave," she said quietly. "I've been concerned about some of these development approvals for months, but I've been outvoted at every turn. I'd like to help if I can." The young woman with a press badge also made her way over. Sarah Williams, County Chronicle. She said, "I'd be interested in hearing more about this situation. Not many people stand up to the Wilkins machine." I barely had time to exchange contact information with them before Karen Wilkins intercepted us, her husband hovering behind her with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Quite a performance, Mr. Thompson," Karen said, "but airing grievances publicly like this is hardly productive. We could have resolved this privately." James extended his hand. "Perhaps we should meet to discuss this situation like businessmen. I'm sure we can find a mutually beneficial arrangement." His tone was friendly, but his grip when I shook his hand was crushing. Karen wasn't as subtle. "You're making a serious mistake," she hissed when her husband turned to speak with the mayor. "Nobody goes against us and comes out ahead. Nobody." 3 days later, Sarah's article appeared in the County Chronicle Historic Ranch at Center of Controversial Development Plan. The piece detailed my family's long history with the land, the HOA's harassment campaign, and raised questions about the ethics of the city's approval processes. The online version went viral locally with hundreds of comments supporting Sweetwater and criticizing the Wilkins tactics. The publicity had an immediate effect. Several Oak Ridge residents reached out, sharing their own stories of Karen's tyrannical rule over the HOA. One woman, who asked to remain anonymous, explained how Karen had forced her to remove a memorial garden planted for her deceased daughter because it used non-approved plants. Others described excessive fines, selective enforcement of rules, and a climate of fear within the community. "Most of us are afraid to speak up." One elderly resident told me, "They control everything from the architectural committee to the landscaping companies allowed in the neighborhood. Cross them, and suddenly your fence needs emergency repairs or your water gets shut off for maintenance." The article also brought me an unexpected ally. One evening, as I was finishing chores, a sleek car with tinted windows pulled up to my house. A young man in his early 30s stepped out, looking nervously over his shoulder before approaching. "I'm Ethan Wilkins," he said. "Karen and James's son. We need to talk, but not here. Can you meet me tomorrow?" We arranged to meet at a diner 30 miles away in the next county. Ethan explained that he worked as an architect for his father's company, but had grown increasingly disturbed by his parents' business practices. "They've done this before," he said, pushing food around his plate. "Buy land cheaply, develop it at maximum density, sell for a huge profit, then move on. But they've never encountered resistance like yours. Mom is unstable when she doesn't get her way, and she's getting worse. I've seen her shaking with rage. When your name comes up," Ethan provided me with internal documents showing that James had an arrangement with First Community Bank to deny loans to property owners in areas targeted for acquisition. This explained why I'd been rejected for a ranch improvement loan despite excellent credit. "They're desperate to complete Oak Ridge Grand," Ethan confided. "Dad leveraged everything on this development. If it fails, they lose everything." Strange incidents began occurring at the ranch with increasing frequency. One night, all my cattle mysteriously escaped despite the gates being chained and locked. Another time, I discovered sugar in the gas tanks of both tractors. The final straw came when I was awakened at 2:00 in the morning by Jake pounding on my door, yelling that the hay barn was on fire. We managed to contain the blaze before it spread to other buildings, but the loss was still significant. The fire inspector found clear evidence of arson, accelerant patterns, and a broken window. When Deputy Mark Johnson came to take the report, he seemed uncomfortable. Mark and I had grown up together, but his hands were tied. "Off the record, Mason. I know who's behind this," he said quietly. "But the sheriff plays poker with James Wilkins every Thursday, and I've been told to handle complaints about your property with appropriate skepticism. I'll file the report, but don't expect much." I had installed security cameras after the cattle incident, but the system had been mysteriously disabled just before the fire. It was becoming clear that I was fighting not just the Wilkins family, but a network of influence that extended throughout the county's power structure. That night, unable to sleep, I sat on my porch with a shotgun across my lap, scanning the darkness for any movement. The ranch had never felt less like home than it did in that moment. A target under siege rather than a sanctuary. I thought about giving up, about taking whatever offer James would make just to end the nightmare. But then, I remembered the generations of Thompsons who had held this land through world wars, the Great Depression, and countless hardships. If they hadn't given up, how could I? The next morning, I called Sam with a new determination in my voice. "I'm done playing defense," I told him. It's time to take the fight to them. The next day, Rachel and I were checking a section of stream that ran through both our properties when she pointed out something troubling. "The water doesn't look right," she said, crouching down to examine the surface. There was an oily sheen on the water, and a chemical smell hung in the air. We followed the stream upstream to where it entered my property from land adjacent to Oak Ridge Estates. There, hidden among the trees, we discovered several barrels leaking a viscous substance directly into the water. "This is toxic," Rachel said, her face grim. "This could be construction runoff or waste from their development. Either way, it's highly illegal." We took photos and water samples, then called the State Environmental Protection Agency. The investigator who came out confirmed our suspicions. The water contained hazardous chemicals used in construction. When I asked how quickly they could take action, his expression told me everything I needed to know. "We'll file a report," he said wearily. But these investigations take time, especially when influential local figures are involved. That night, I installed a new, more sophisticated security system with cellular backup and hidden cameras around the property. I wasn't taking any more chances. If the Wilkins were going to escalate, I needed to be prepared. The following week was relatively quiet, suspiciously so. No letters from the HOA, no mysterious visitors. It felt like the calm before a storm. I used the respite to work with Sam on a multi-pronged legal strategy. We filed a formal complaint about the right-of-way approval, documented the environmental violations, and prepared a harassment case against both the HOA and the Wilkins personally. "They're waiting for you to get tired and give up," Sam warned. "Most people do. They don't have the resources or stamina for a prolonged fight against people with this much power." I also reached out to Sarah at the County Chronicle, providing her with updates and evidence for additional articles. The more public scrutiny on the Wilkins empire, the better. And I had another angle to pursue. With Councilwoman Chen's help, I began the process of having Sweetwater Ranch designated as a historical landmark. Such a designation would make development nearly impossible and protect the land regardless of who owned it. The application required extensive documentation of the ranch's historical significance, which meant long nights researching my family's archives and interviewing elderly community members who remembered the ranch's role in local history. While visiting the County Historical Society for research, I made another unexpected discovery. An elderly volunteer showed me a map from the 1970s that clearly indicated that part of what was now Oak Ridge Estates had originally been Sweetwater land, sold by my grandfather to a development company, but with a specific covenant restricting future use. "Your granddaddy was smart," the volunteer said, "and put in writing that if they ever tried to use that land for anything but single-family homes, the Thompson family would have first right to buy it back at the original sale price plus inflation." I immediately called Sam and emailed him the documents. He was cautiously optimistic. If this holds up legally, and that's a big if, after 50 years, it could give us leverage over a significant portion of their development plans. Oak Ridge Grand includes commercial spaces, which would violate the covenant. It was a slim hope, but at this point I would take any advantage I could get. The Wilkins' next move came from an unexpected direction. One morning, I received a call from the local bank handling my ranch mortgage. Despite always making payments on time, they were reviewing my loan and considering calling it due in full because of concerns about property condition and value. It was a transparent attempt to force me into financial distress. Fortunately, my tech job had paid well, and I had savings to weather the storm. I immediately began seeking refinancing with banks outside the county beyond James Wilkins' sphere of influence. Just as I was making headway with a bank in Austin, Rachel called in a panic. "They're surveying my property," she said. "There are men with equipment all over my south field, claiming they have permission from the city for a watershed assessment." I drove over immediately. Sure enough, a crew in official-looking vests was taking measurements and soil samples. When I asked to see their authorization, they produced documents with the city seal, signed by none other than Mayor Davis. Rachel was livid. This is private property. They can't just come onto my land because the mayor says so." The crew leader seemed genuinely confused by our objection. "Ma'am, we're just following orders. The watershed assessment is part of the new Oak Ridge Grand project. All neighboring properties are included." The implication was clear. The Wilkins were proceeding as if approval for their development was already a foregone conclusion, despite the ongoing disputes and investigations. Later that day, I received an unexpected visit from Frank, who had stuck around after the council meeting to keep an eye on things. As we sat on the porch watching the sunset, he revealed that he'd been making calls to old military contacts who were now in state politics. "This isn't just about your ranch anymore, Mason," he said. "There's a pattern of corruption in this county that goes beyond the Wilkins. I've arranged a meeting next week with someone from the state attorney general's office who specializes in municipal corruption cases." Frank's support gave me a much-needed boost of confidence. He was right. This had grown beyond a personal fight over my property. It was about standing up to a system that allowed powerful people to bully and manipulate others for profit. The next few days brought a flurry of activity. Sarah's latest article highlighted the suspicious connection between Mayor Davis's approvals and James Wilkins' projects, complete with a timeline showing how every major Wilkins development had received unprecedented fast-tracking and tax incentives. The county assessor's office suddenly discovered errors in my property tax assessment, retroactively increasing my taxes for the past 3 years. And, most alarming, Rachel reported that someone had approached her with an aggressive offer to buy her ranch, hinting that she should follow her friend's example before things get difficult. They were attacking from all sides, pressuring anyone who supported me. But their tactics were backfiring. Each heavy-handed move created more documentation of their pattern of harassment, strengthening our legal position. Moreover, public opinion was turning against them as Sarah's articles exposed more of their methods. Local farmers and ranchers, concerned they might be next, began showing up at Sweetwater to offer help with chores or simply to stand in solidarity. One morning, I awoke to find a dozen pickup trucks parked along my driveway, their owners fixing fences, repairing the fire damage to my barn, and patrolling the property lines. The community was rallying around us. The meeting with the representative from the state attorney general's office was promising. The agent, a no-nonsense woman named Teresa Gonzalez, listened carefully to our evidence and took copious notes. "This is exactly the kind of case we're interested in," she said. "Systemic corruption at the local level often goes unchecked because victims feel isolated and powerless. But you've done an exceptional job documenting everything." She explained that they had received similar complaints from 2 other counties, where the Wilkins had previously developed properties. "We've been building a case for some time, but victims usually settle privately and sign NDAs. You're the first one willing to go public." The investigation would take time, she warned, but she authorized us to mention that the state was now involved, a fact that might make the Wilkins and their allies more cautious. Armed with this new leverage, I decided to implement the next phase of our strategy. With Sam's guidance, I began researching the financial structure of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. Most homeowners associations are registered as nonprofit corporations with specific legal requirements for governance and financial management. Sam suspected that Karen's iron-fisted control might not comply with state laws regarding HOA operations. We discovered that the HOA was required to hold annual elections and maintain transparent financial records accessible to all members, neither of which had happened under Karen's leadership. Through contacts supplied by sympathetic Oak Ridge residents, we obtained internal financial documents showing that Karen had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, including landscaping for her own property and even payments to her husband's company for consulting services at inflated rates. Even more damning, she had significantly increased mandatory dues while cutting services, creating a surplus that was being funneled into accounts controlled by James rather than being used for community improvements. With this information in hand, I decided to attend the next Oak Ridge Estates HOA meeting. Technically, a public meeting according to their bylaws, though outsiders rarely attended. Walking into the Oak Ridge clubhouse felt like entering enemy territory. Karen was holding court at the front of the room, reviewing a list of new landscaping restrictions when she spotted me. Her perfectly maintained smile froze in place. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice dripping with false civility. "This is a private community meeting. I'm afraid you'll have to leave." I remained standing near the back. "Actually, according to your bylaws, regular HOA meetings are open to the public. I'm here as an interested neighbor." Several residents turned to look at me with a mixture of curiosity and alarm. Karen's face flushed, but before she could respond, an elderly man stood up. "Since we have an outsider here, perhaps we could finally get some answers about the financial reports we've been requesting for the past 3 years. Or maybe discuss the special assessment for the new security system that was installed only around your house, Mrs. Wilkins." Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. Clearly, I wasn't the only one with grievances. Karen attempted to regain control of the meeting, but the dam had broken. One by one, residents began voicing complaints and questions that had obviously been suppressed for years. Why had their dues increased by 60% while services decreased? Why were certain contractors, all connected to James Wilkins, given exclusive rights to work in the community at rates well above market value? Why had there been no election for HOA board positions in 5 years? Throughout the chaos, I remained silent, simply observing as Karen's authority crumbled in real time. When she finally adjourned the meeting without addressing any concerns, several residents approached me. "We've wanted to say something for years," one woman whispered. "But she always finds a way to punish anyone who speaks up." I handed out my phone number to those who seemed most eager to share information, promising to help however I could. As I left the clubhouse, I felt Karen's eyes burning into my back. I had just undermined her power base, and I knew her retaliation would be swift and severe. That night, my new security system proved its worth. The cameras captured 3 men in dark clothing attempting to approach the house from the back property line. When the motion-activated lights came on, they retreated into the woods. I sent the footage to Deputy Mark, who reluctantly agreed to increase patrols near my property. "Tune. I can't promise much," he admitted. "But not everyone on the force is in Wilkins's pocket. Some of us still believe in doing the job right." The next morning, Rachel called with alarming news. Water samples from our stream had come back from a private lab we'd hired. The contamination levels were dangerously high, well above legal limits for several toxic chemicals. "This isn't just construction runoff," she explained. "These are industrial solvents and chemicals that have no business being anywhere near a watershed. They're deliberately dumping hazardous waste on the property line." This was a serious environmental crime that even James Wilkins' connections couldn't easily dismiss. We immediately forwarded the results to Agent Gonzalez and the State Environmental Agency, bypassing local authorities altogether. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visit from Sandra Davis, the mayor's wife. She arrived alone, looking nervous but determined. "Robert doesn't know I'm here," she said, as we sat at my kitchen table. "But this has gone far enough. I can't stand by anymore." Sandra revealed that her husband was deeply indebted to James Wilkins, both financially and politically. James had funded the mayor's campaigns and provided loans for their vacation home. In return, he expected unwavering support for his projects, regardless of merit or legality. "Robert started out just bending the rules a little," she explained. "But it's gotten out of hand. James and Karen have something on everyone in local government. Financial problems, personal issues, embarrassing secrets. They use it all as leverage." She handed me a USB drive. "These are Robert's emails with James about your property and others. There's enough here to prove collusion and probably criminal conspiracy." I asked why she was taking such a risk. "Because Karen threatened our daughter when Robert started having second thoughts about the right-of-way through your ranch. Said she'd make sure everyone knew about her DUI from college. That's when I realized these people have no limits. The information Sandra provided was the missing piece we needed. With clear evidence of corruption reaching the highest levels of local government, Agent Gonzalez was able to secure approval for a full investigation. Within days, state investigators began issuing subpoenas for records from the mayor's office, the city planning department, and Wilkins Development Group. The pressure was starting to show. James canceled several public appearances, and Karen was uncharacteristically absent from community events. Through Ethan, we learned that his parents were frantically trying to secure additional financing for Oak Ridge Grand, as several investors had pulled out after hearing about the state investigation. This was our opportunity to strike. Sam had been researching the financial structure of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA and discovered that it had taken out significant loans for infrastructure improvements, loans that were now in danger of default due to Karen's mismanagement of funds. With financial backing from Uncle Frank and a loan from my Austin bank, I made an audacious move. I bought the HOA's debt from the increasingly nervous lenders, effectively becoming the HOA's primary creditor. At the same time, Sam filed legal paperwork activating my grandfather's covenant on the original Sweetwater land that had been sold for Oak Ridge's development. Since the planned expansion included commercial spaces, we had grounds to exercise the right of first refusal at the original sale price, adjusted for inflation, but still far below current market value. This would give us control over a critical section of land that included the HOA headquarters and, ironically, the Wilkins' own home. Our legal maneuvers coincided with a major exposé by Sarah detailing how the Wilkins had used similar tactics in 2 other counties, leaving behind damaged communities and environmental problems while pocketing millions in profits. The article included interviews with former officials who admitted to taking bribes and homeowners who had been forced out through harassment and intimidation. The story went beyond the local paper, getting picked up by regional news outlets and drawing attention from state officials concerned about patterned corruption. The Wilkins empire was beginning to crumble, but Karen wasn't going down without a fight. One evening, my security system alerted me to movement near the stream where we discovered the chemical dumping. Checking the camera feed, I was shocked to see Karen herself, accompanied by 2 men, unloading containers near the water. I called Deputy Mark immediately, then grabbed my phone to record video as backup. By the time I reached the stream, Karen was directing the men to pour something into the water. "Stop right there!" I shouted, phone recording. "The police are on their way." Karen whirled around, her face contorted with rage. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Pointing, turning everyone against us, threatening everything we've built. One of the men started to leave, but Karen barked at him to stay. Then, to my shock, she reached into her purse and pulled out a handgun. "This is still my land," she said, pointing the weapon at me, "and you're trespassing." I kept my phone recording, trying to remain calm. "This isn't your land, Karen. This is Sweetwater Ranch property. You're the one trespassing. And now you're pointing a gun at me while committing environmental crimes." Her hand shook slightly, but the gun remained pointed at my chest. "It doesn't matter. When we're done, none of this will be yours. One way or another, this ranch will be part of Oak Ridge Grand." The sound of approaching vehicles caused her accomplices to panic. "Karen, this isn't worth it," one of them said. "Let's go." For a moment, I thought she might actually pull the trigger. There was a wildness in her eyes that went beyond anger, something unhinged and dangerous. Finally, she lowered the gun. "This isn't over, Thompson," she spat, backing toward their vehicle. Not by a long shot. As they sped away, Deputy Mark arrived, followed closely by 2 state environmental officers who had been monitoring the stream. The entire confrontation had been captured not only on my phone, but on the security cameras I'd installed after the previous dumping incident. This time, there would be no denying what had happened. Karen's armed confrontation proved to be the tipping point. She was arrested the following day on charges of illegal dumping, trespassing, and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. James attempted to distance himself, claiming he had no knowledge of his wife's actions, but the evidence Sandra had provided showed his direct involvement in the harassment campaign. The State Attorney General's office expanded its investigation, freezing the assets of Wilkins Development Group and the personal accounts of both Karen and James, pending the outcome. With their financial resources constrained, the Wilkins found themselves suddenly vulnerable. Many of their political allies abandoned them, unwilling to risk their own careers by continuing to support the couple. Mayor Davis resigned, citing health concerns, though everyone knew he was cooperating with investigators to save himself. The HOA board, emboldened by Karen's arrest, called an emergency meeting and voted to remove her as president. As the HOA's primary creditor, I attended the meeting and proposed a restructuring plan that would dramatically reduce resident fees while increasing transparency and democratic governance. Relief among homeowners was palpable. Many had suffered under Karen's reign for years without believing change was possible. Meanwhile, Sam successfully activated my grandfather's covenant, giving me legal control over the central parcel of Oak Ridge Estates, including the land beneath the Wilkins' own mansion. James made a last-ditch attempt to negotiate, offering to abandon all claims to Sweetwater in exchange for withdrawing the covenant claim. "You don't understand what you're doing," he warned during our meeting at Sam's office. "This isn't just about land anymore. You're destroying lives. Our lives." There was a desperation in his voice that almost made me consider his offer. Almost. "I understand exactly what I'm doing," I replied calmly. "I'm holding you accountable for what you've done to me, to Rachel, to everyone whose lives you've damaged in pursuit of profit. You chose this path, not me." The legal proceedings dragged on for months, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Karen was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to probation and community service, avoiding jail time only because nobody had been physically injured during her armed confrontation with me. James faced more serious consequences. Multiple counts of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy resulted in a 3-year prison sentence and the forfeiture of most of their assets to pay restitution. And the Wilkins' reputation was destroyed, their social standing evaporated, and their financial empire dismantled. As for Oak Ridge Estates, I worked with the newly elected HOA board to create a more equitable governance structure. Fees were reduced, arbitrary restrictions eliminated, and a democratic process implemented for all major decisions. The land I controlled through the covenant was partially designated as a community green space, with the remainder set aside for sustainable development that complemented, rather than obliterated, the area's rural character. Sweetwater Ranch itself was officially designated a state historical landmark, ensuring its protection for generations to come. Rachel and I continued to grow closer throughout the ordeal, our shared struggle creating a bond that eventually blossomed into something deeper. Her children began spending more time at Sweetwater, learning ranching skills from Jake, and developing a love for the land that matched my own. Ethan Wilkins, who had risked so much to help us, established his own architectural firm, specializing in sustainable design and historic preservation. He occasionally consulted on improvements to Sweetwater, finding a measure of redemption and helping preserve what his parents had tried to destroy. As for Karen and James, they left the county after James completed his sentence, reportedly moving to Florida to start over. Their mansion, once the crown jewel of Oak Ridge Estates, was converted into a community center and local history museum, a transformation that seemed fitting given the circumstances. 1 year after Karen had pointed a gun at my face, we held the first annual Sweetwater Heritage Festival on the ranch. Hundreds of people came to celebrate local history, agriculture, and community. Even some Oak Ridge residents attended, no longer separated from their rural neighbors by walls of hostility. Standing on the porch of the farmhouse, where generations of Thompsons had stood before me, I surveyed the scene with a sense of peace I hadn't felt since inheriting the property. Rachel slipped her hand into mine, leaning against my shoulder as we watched children playing in the same fields where I had played as a boy. "Sometimes," I said to the gathering during my brief welcome speech, "you have to stand up not just for what belongs to you, but for what's right. And sometimes the bad guys need a lesson about why you don't point guns at a man on his ancestral land." The crowd laughed and applauded. Uncle Frank, now a regular visitor to the ranch, raised his glass in a toast. "To the land that brings us together, and the courage to defend it." Jake, officially retired but still an everyday presence at Sweetwater, wiped away a tear as he looked out over the property he had helped maintain for most of his life. "Your parents would be proud," he told me later, "not just of keeping the ranch, but of how you did it. Standing up for what's right, even when it wasn't easy." In the end, this wasn't just about saving my family's ranch from a power-hungry HOA president. It was about restoring balance and justice to a community that had lost its way. It was about remembering that some things, heritage, community, basic human decency, matter more than profit margins and property values. I still get emails and letters from people around the country facing similar battles with overzealous HOAs or corrupt local officials. I tell them all the same thing: document everything, build community support, and never forget that you have more power than you realize. Most importantly, I remind them that while standing up to bullies isn't easy, the alternative, letting them win, is far worse in the long run. Rachel and I were married last spring in the meadow behind the farmhouse, with Jake giving her away and her children serving as our wedding party. As the sun sets over Sweetwater tonight, I'm reminded that the most valuable inheritance my parents left me wasn't the land itself, but the conviction that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the odds. And that sometimes justice comes in unexpected forms, like buying the HOA that tried to destroy you and watching your tormentor pack her designer clothes into cardboard boxes as she's evicted from her own home. Not for revenge, but because actions have consequences.